Welcome to Sleepy Time Stories. Hey dear friends, deep beneath the quiet slopes of Mount Shasta, something strange has been whispered about for generations. Hidden tunnels, forgotten passages, and stories that never made it into official history. Some say they were carved by ancient civilizations long before recorded time. Others believe they lead to places still untouched by modern exploration. But no matter how many theories appear, one thing remains the same. No one has ever been able to fully explain what truly lies below. Before starting the story, like and subscribe to my channel for more relaxing stories. Now start the story. Tonight, we slowly step into that mystery, not to find answers, but to drift through the unknown. Settle in, get comfortable, and let your mind drift. There's a mountain in the north of California that has held a quiet pull on people for a very long time, long before any of us were here. It's not the kind of call that brings climbers looking for a challenge, or tourists with cameras, or scientists with their measuring tools. The people who feel it can't quite put a name to it. It starts softly, perhaps in a dream, a fleeting image that feels more like a memory. And it grows into a quiet knowing, a gentle certainty that they must go there. They arrive from all corners of the world, speaking 1,000 different languages, carrying with them the weight of countless different lives. And yet, they all end up in the same place, standing at the foot of the same steep volcanic peak, looking up at its snow-capped face, and finding the same thought forming in their minds, just in different words. There is something down there, something very old, something that was here long before the first human footstep. And the more you sit with the whispers of this story, the harder it becomes to turn away and pretend you haven't heard it all before. If you're here to let the world slip away and find your rest, then you are in exactly the right place. Perhaps you might like to subscribe and let me know in the quiet of your thoughts where you are right now and what the clock says. Mount Shasta rises 14,179 feet above the earth of Northern California. It stands utterly alone. That solitude is important. Most mountains are part of a family, connected to their neighbors by long ridges and shared valley floors. But Shasta is set apart from the Cascade chain in a way that makes it seem almost intentional, as if it was carefully placed. The native peoples who have lived in this region for countless generations noticed this too. They didn't call it luck or a random act of geology. They called it a presence, and they built entire worlds of understanding around what that presence meant. But we are moving ahead of ourselves. Before we can ponder what might slumber beneath the mountain, we should first understand the mountain itself. Its physical nature is not separate from the mystery. It is the very heart of it. Shasta is a stratovolcano built from countless layers of hardened lava, ancient ash, and pyroclastic material that have been piling up for roughly 600,000 years. The last big burst of activity happened about 300 years ago, with some smaller whispers of life possibly as recent as the early 20th century. This is not a mountain that has fallen asleep forever. It breathes. Its sides are laced with fumaroles, vents that exhale sulfurous gases from deep within the earth. Hot springs bubble up around its base, a constant reminder of the heat that churns far below. The heavy snow on top and the geothermal warmth beneath create a unique environment, a place where the boundary between solid stone and open space is always shifting, always changing. And here we find the first geological detail that makes researchers pause. Lava tubes. When fast-moving basaltic lava cools unevenly on the surface, the outer shell hardens while the molten rock continues to flow beneath. When the interior eventually empties out, it leaves behind a tunnel, a hollow tube of stone. These formations are found all over the world, some of the most famous being in Iceland, Hawaii, and the Canary Islands. They can stretch for miles, be tall enough to walk through, and they branch and connect in complex ways that take years to map fully. California has its own lava tubes, and the area around Mount Shasta has the right kind of geology to produce very extensive ones. However, the tunnel systems beneath and around Shasta have never been fully explored. The terrain above is challenging. Many areas are protected, some require special permits, and others are simply too dangerous for a detailed survey. What we know about the mountain's hidden depths comes mostly from remote sensing, seismic readings, and the stories of those who went looking on their own. And it's those personal accounts where the story begins to get truly interesting. The first written hints of something strange beneath Mount Shasta appear in the late 19th century. This is important context. The 1880s and 90s were a time of great public fascination with lost worlds. Heinrich Schliemann had just unearthed the ruins of Troy. Newspapers were filled with reports of the ancient cities of Mesoamerica. A movement called Theosophy, built on the idea of ancient wisdom preserved in secret lineages, was spreading quickly through the educated circles of Europe and America. The world was ready for discoveries of this very kind. But the Mount Shasta accounts don't read like clever fictions. They read like the earnest, muddled attempts of people trying to describe something they truly didn't understand. The first major account comes from 1884, published in the Eureka Journal, a small local paper north of the mountain. A miner named Frederick Spencer Oliver was living near the base of Shasta while working his claims. He reported a series of encounters with individuals he described as unusually tall, dressed in white or pale robes, and not particularly interested in interacting with strangers. They appeared on the lower slopes at dawn and dusk, and they would vanish back into the landscape without leaving a trace of their passage. Oliver didn't claim they were supernatural. He was a practical, straightforward mining man. He simply said they were people living somewhere within the mountain. He went on to write a book that he claimed was channeled to him from a spirit connected to the mountain, a work called A Dweller on Two Planets. The framing is easy to dismiss, and most historians do dismiss it on those grounds. But tucked away inside the book are very detailed descriptions of underground rooms, ventilation systems, and a culture that kept itself separate from the world above. These descriptions were written decades before the main wave of Mount Shasta mythology. Oliver didn't have a cultural blueprint to copy from. That doesn't prove anything, of course, but it is worth noting. Around the same time, prospectors working the creeks and ravines on the mountain's western side were reporting something different. Sounds, vibrations they could feel through the soles of their boots against the rock. A low hum that would come and go without any clear reason. Several men independently described the same phenomenon at different times in different spots. The vibrations were strongest near certain rock formations, and they would stop completely when the observer moved away. Geologists studying the region at the time attributed the sounds to geothermal activity, hot fluids moving through underground channels, gases escaping through narrow cracks. This is a perfectly reasonable explanation, and it is probably correct for at least some of the reports. But the consistency of the accounts, the way they pinpointed specific locations, and the fact that some of the sounds had a rhythmic quality that witnesses described as almost mechanical, kept tugging at the edges of the official explanation. By the early 20th century, the stories had grown enough to attract the attention of writers and investigators who weren't just passing through. One of the most significant of these was Edward Lanza, a journalist who published a long piece in the Los Angeles Times Sunday magazine in 1932. The article was titled something like California's Mystic Mountain, and it was built on interviews Lanza had conducted with people living in the Mount Shasta region. The picture that came out of those conversations was remarkably consistent. Local residents, including farmers, loggers, and shopkeepers who had no interest in the mountain's mystical reputation, described seeing lights moving across the slopes at night. Not campfires, not hikers' lanterns, but lights that moved in deliberate patterns, appearing at elevations where no trails existed. They described meeting people in the forest near the mountain, who spoke with unusual accents, who wore clothing that didn't match any regional style, and who would buy things in local stores with gold nuggets instead of regular money. When locals tried to follow these people back into the woods, they would lose track of them in terrain that offered no logical hiding places. No camps were ever found, no footprints led anywhere. The individuals would simply stop being traceable. Lanz's article didn't make any grand claims. It just reported what people said. And what people said was that there was some kind of community connected to the mountain, a community that kept itself separate and seemed to have everything it needed right there. Now, before we go any further, it is worth sitting with what the conventional explanations can actually account for. Some of the rogue figures were almost certainly members of the I Am activity, a religious movement founded by Guy Ballard in the 1930s that centered on Mount Shasta as a holy place. They did wear distinctive clothes, they did perform rituals on and around the mountain, and they did act in ways that seemed strange to outsiders. This explains a portion of the sightings, especially those from the mid-century onward. Some of the lights were almost certainly natural atmospheric phenomena. The mountain creates its own, whether due to its height and solitude. Lenticular clouds, which form over high peaks, can sometimes create glowing effects that experienced observers have mistaken for something else. Ball lightning, though rare and not fully understood, has been seen in volcanic areas. Geologically active regions can also produce what researchers call earthquake lights, a glow from electromagnetic effects caused by stressed rock. Some of the underground sounds were almost certainly geothermal. The mountain is not dormant. Its internal heat keeps fluids moving constantly, and this movement creates sound and vibration. It creates the exact kind of low hum that witnesses have described. All of this accounts for some of it. The problem is it doesn't account for all of it. And the part that remains unexplained is where the real inquiry begins. Here is what the conventional explanations don't address. They don't address the testimony of trained geologists and geographers who conducted surveys of the lower slopes in the 1940s and reported finding cave openings that didn't match any known lava tube formation in their records. Openings that led into passages too regular and structured to be natural. They don't address the accounts of many independent witnesses who all point to the same specific spot on the northern face. A spot marked by a certain rock formation above a wide ledge, as a place where the mountain seems to open and close. A place where people have gone in and not come out. A place where the air temperature is dramatically and consistently different from the surrounding area. They don't address the oral traditions of the people who lived near this mountain for thousands of years before any Europeans set foot here. And these traditions are where the story finds its deepest roots. The Shasta people, the Modoc, the Akamawi, the Wintu, the Karuk, these are all distinct nations. They speak different languages, they have different ceremonies, different histories, and different relationships with the land. But they all share one thing when it comes to Mount Shasta. They all describe it as a place where the normal rules don't apply, where the world above and the world beneath are not as separate as they are elsewhere, where ancestors go, where spirits live, where time moves in a different way. This alignment across independent cultures is not something to brush aside. These groups were not simply borrowing from each other. The Modoc and the Wintu had significant cultural and linguistic differences. The Karuk held their own distinct identity and ceremonial life. They didn't all reach the same conclusion about the mountain because they were copying from a shared source. They reached it because they had long and separate relationships with the same mountain. And what they observed over all those years led them to the same description. The Wintu, in particular, preserved very specific accounts. Their oral tradition tells of a people who live inside the mountain. Not as a metaphor, but literally inside. A people who travel between the inner world and the surface world through specific passages known only to the mountain's guardians. The Wintu themselves didn't use these passages. It wasn't their place to do so. But they knew the passages existed because they had seen the people who used them. The description of these inner people is consistent across many generations of Wintu testimony. They were tall. Their skin was light, perhaps even with a kind of soft radiance. They wore garments that were not made from animal hide or plant fiber in the way the Wintu made their own clothing. They possessed knowledge of healing that went far beyond what anyone on the surface had ever developed. And they were not hostile. When they did appear near Wintu villages, which was rare and always for a purpose, they came bearing gifts of knowledge, warnings, and sometimes objects that had no counterpart in the surface world. The Modoc accounts are somewhat different in nature, but they arrive at the same conclusion. Their tradition describes the mountain as the place where the Creator first descended to the earth. The interior of the mountain is the Creator's home. It is not that entry is forbidden. It is simply not possible for a human being who hasn't been called. The Modoc didn't see these underground inhabitants as a separate species. They saw them as an older family line, a people who had been there long before the surface world was inhabited by anyone. The Akamawi, who live to the east and south of the mountain, hold traditions about underground passages connecting Shasta to other significant places in the region. They describe a network, not just a single tunnel, a system of connected pathways through which certain individuals could travel great distances beneath the earth. The Akamawi didn't claim these passages as their own. They described them the way you might describe a road on someone else's land. It is there, you know it is there, but it is not yours to travel. A young boy once sat with his grandfather at the base of a mountain, so old it had watched 10,000 generations of people come and go. He was 7 years old. His grandfather was the last person in their family who still carried the full oral tradition, the unbroken chain of words that had been passed down from speaker to speaker for as long as anyone could remember. The fire between them was small. The night was cold. Above them, the mountain's white peak caught the sliver of moonlight that remained after the clouds had drifted across the sky. The grandfather spoke slowly. He wasn't performing a story. He was remembering, and there's a great difference between the two. When you perform, you look at your audience. When you remember, you look somewhere else entirely. He looked at the mountain. He said that when his own grandfather was young, a man came to the village from the lower passages. Not from the forest, but from below, from the place where the stone opens. This man wasn't afraid. He wasn't asking for help. He was delivering something, a piece of knowledge about a coming dry season. It was so specific that the village was able to prepare, to move their planting, to store water in a way they wouldn't have thought of on their own. The dry season came, just as he had described, and the village survived it better than any of their neighbors who had not received the warning. The boy asked his grandfather what the man from below had looked like. The grandfather was quiet for a long time. Then he said, he looked like someone who had never worried about the sun. That is a story that has been told in many ways across many generations. The details don't matter as much as the pattern. The pattern is this. The mountain holds something, and sometimes what it holds reaches out. The point isn't any single story. The point is that this kind of account, stories describing deliberate contact between surface people and underground people connected to Mount Shasta, appears again and again across many separate cultures and many centuries of documentation. That pattern is the thing. In 1904, A geologist named J.C. Brown was working for a British mining company called Sunnyside Gold. His job was to survey mineral deposits in Northern California. It was routine work. The company needed to know what was worth digging for. Brown was competent and experienced. He had worked claims in Montana and British Columbia before coming to California, and he was not the kind of man to let his imagination run wild. According to accounts that surfaced decades later, Brown's survey of the Mount Shasta area led him to discover a series of cave openings on the mountain's northern and western sides. But what he found inside these caves was not what he was looking for. He found tunnels, but not natural ones. Tunnels with walls that showed signs of having been deliberately shaped. Tunnels that kept a very consistent width throughout their length. Tunnels whose floors were smooth, either from being carefully leveled or from having been walked on for an extremely long time. He also found things, objects carved from stone and what appeared to be worked metal, statues of a scale and craftsmanship that had no equal among anything attributed to the known pre-Columbian peoples of California. He documented everything he found as carefully as he could with his field equipment. He took notes. He made sketches. He collected small samples. Then he sealed the entrance to the passage he had been exploring, marked its location on a private map, and told no one, not his employers, not his colleagues, about what he had found. For more than 30 years, he said nothing. In 1934, Brown reappeared. He was old by then, in his 80s, and he had apparently decided he was running out of time to do something with what he knew. He contacted researchers connected to a group studying pre-Columbian North American cultures and offered to lead an expedition to the site. He gathered together a group of 80 people, a mix of interested academics, journalists, and members of the public, and announced that he was going to take them to the tunnels and show them what he had discovered 3 decades earlier. The expedition never happened. J.C. Brown died shortly before they were scheduled to leave. His maps were never found. His notes, if they had survived at all, have never been located in any archive. The 80 people who were ready to follow him dispersed. Some gave interviews describing what Brown had told them. Others never spoke of it again. The story of the 1934 expedition exists almost entirely in secondhand accounts. This is the part of the Mount Shasta story that serious researchers find most frustrating. Not because Brown's account is necessarily more believable than others, but because of the structure of what happened. The decades of silence, the final disclosure near the end of his life, and then the death just as the verification was about to happen. It follows a pattern that appears again and again in the Shasta record. Accounts that are substantial enough to take seriously, interrupted at the very moment when they could be proven. Whether this pattern reflects something about the nature of what is being discovered, or something about the kind of people who discover it, or simply the operation of ordinary bad luck on a subject already difficult to verify, is a question without a clean answer. The 1930s brought a different kind of attention to the mountain. The Rosicrucian order, a philosophical and esoteric group with roots in 17th century Europe, published claims that Mount Shasta was one of several places on Earth where underground civilization stayed in contact with the surface. The Rosicrucians were very clear about the nature of these civilizations. They described them as remnants of Lemuria, a theoretical lost continent that some theosophical writers had proposed as an ancient predecessor to Atlantis. The Lemurian hypothesis has a complicated history. In the 19th century, before plate tectonics was understood, some scientists did propose a lost landmass in the Indian Ocean to explain the distribution of lemurs across widely separated islands. The name Lemuria was actually geological in origin and proposed with serious intent. When plate tectonics later explained the distribution through continental drift, the geological Lemuria was abandoned. But by then, theosophical writers had borrowed the name and attached an entire civilization to it. Helena Blavatsky, the founder of Theosophy, described Lemurians as a root race, a very ancient form of human consciousness that predated modern humanity. In her framework, different root races have dominated the Earth in sequence, and each previous race didn't completely disappear, but retreated, surviving in a hidden or diminished form while the newer race took over the surface. The Lemurians in this framework had gone underground. They had retreated from the surface world as it became more populated by the newer races, and had kept their civilization alive in the spaces beneath the Earth. This is mythology. There is no geological or archaeological evidence for a lost Pacific continent. The Lemurian story is a spiritual framework, not a historical claim. But here is the difficulty. The Lemurian story, which arrived at Mount Shasta through Theosophy and the Rosicrucians in the early 20th century, attached itself to a place that already had a very old local tradition of underground people. The new mythology didn't create the stories. It absorbed stories that were already there and simply gave them a different meaning. The question that researchers have to face is whether the Lemurian overlay helped to clarify something true, or whether it twisted something true. Whether the elaborate framework of Theosophy helped identify a real phenomenon, or whether it captured that phenomenon in language so full of cultural baggage that the real signal, whatever it might have been, became nearly impossible to find. This is not a small problem. It affects how every single piece of evidence gets interpreted. When a Winta elder describes the people who come from inside the mountain, is that description being reported accurately, or has it been filtered through a Lemurian lens by the time it reaches a written record? When a prospector describes a strange sound, is his account being taken at face value, or is it being absorbed into a story that makes it impossible to judge on its own terms? This overlay problem is real, and it is one of the reasons the Mount Shasta evidence is so hard to work with. You have to constantly ask not just what was seen, but what framework was used to translate that sight into words, and whether that framework added something or removed something. By the middle of the 20th century, the mountain had built a reputation that attracted a certain kind of visitor. People who were already sure of the Lemurian story would arrive hoping for confirmation. They often found exactly what they were looking for because they knew what to look for and were ready to accept anything even slightly unusual as evidence. This is a significant problem. Motivated perception is not good evidence. But during the same time, a different kind of visitor was also coming to the mountain, and their experiences are much harder to dismiss. Military personnel stationed at training camps in Northern California have described unexplained events near the mountain since as early as the 1940s. The accounts are often incomplete and come from secondhand sources, men describing what they heard from colleagues or friends. But many of these accounts describe the same thing: underground structures, either existing ones that soldiers encountered unexpectedly or ones that seem to be under construction. The period from the late 1940s through the 1960s saw a huge amount of classified building across the American West. The government built deep underground places for communication, for storing nuclear weapons, for government continuity. Some of these facilities are now well known. The NORAD base under Cheyenne Mountain in Colorado is probably the most famous. Others are still classified or only partially acknowledged. Northern California is not a place that appears in the official story of Cold War underground work, but the area around Mount Shasta has certain features that would have made it attractive for certain uses. Its remoteness, its difficult access, and its existing geological complexity that would make outside observation of building work hard to interpret. There is no documented evidence of classified government construction under Mount Shasta. There are Freedom of Information Act requests that have been returned with sections blacked out. There are accounts from people who worked in related fields describing the mountain as a location that needed a special level of clearance to approach. There are local people who talk about sudden changes in access rules around certain areas of the mountain during the mid-century. Places that had once been open to hikers and prospectors suddenly became, without any clear explanation, off-limits. None of this proves anything, but it adds another layer to the story. One that is completely separate from the Lemurian story and points instead toward a different kind of hidden activity. One that is entirely human in its origin and purpose. The question of whether classified human activity in the mountain and the pre-existing traditions about non-human activity in the mountain are completely separate things, or whether they are connected in some way, is one that the available evidence simply doesn't answer. The geology of Mount Shasta has been a subject of serious academic study for many years, but the focus has always been on what is visible: the history of eruptions, the glacial systems, the chemistry of the hot springs. The underground structure, beyond what can be guessed from seismic data and drilling around the edges, is still genuinely poorly understood. What the seismic data does reveal is important. The mountain sits over a subduction zone where the Juan de Fuca plate is being pushed under the North American plate. This process creates heat and drives volcanic activity. It also creates the kind of long, low tremors that geologists connect to the movement of fluids through underground pathways. The tremors under Shasta are not constant, but they come and go at intervals that don't quite match the pattern of simple geothermal fluid movement. There is something about the mountain's underground layout that creates a tremor signature unlike that of other Cascade volcanoes of similar size and age. Volcanologists who have studied its past eruptions note that the layers of lava in Shasta's geological record show something unusual. There are gaps, not just the normal gaps of time between eruptions, but gaps in the composition of the rock. Periods when the material being erupted changed in a way that suggests the conditions deep inside the mountain had shifted significantly. These shifts could mean that the internal network of passages and chambers through which magma moves has changed over time, creating new open spaces and closing old ones. In simple terms, this means the underground layout of the mountain is complex, dynamic, and only partly understood. Any statement about what definitely is not under Shasta is a statement made without the evidence to support it. We simply don't have the technology deployed here at the level needed to map the subsurface fully. This matters because people often treat the absence of proof as proof of absence. And in this case, it is not. We haven't looked carefully enough to say there is nothing to find. In the summer of 1987, a woman named Carol Ryden, who would later write about her experience, was hiking on the western slope of Mount Shasta above the tree line when she saw a man sitting on a rock outcropping. He seemed to have appeared from nowhere, and she hadn't seen him approach. She was alone. The trail she was on was not a busy one. There was no direction he could have come from that she hadn't been watching. The man was tall, taller than average. He wore simple, pale clothing made of a material she didn't recognize. He was looking at the mountain above them, not at her. He didn't seem startled when she came closer. He turned to look at her as if he had known she was coming, but had been waiting for the right moment to acknowledge her. He spoke to her for about 20 minutes. She described the conversation as covering a wide range of things: the mountain's geological past, the existence of underground tunnel systems she had never heard of, and a general picture of the community that used those tunnels. He said they were not supernatural. He said they were not from another world. He said they were people who had simply chosen a different way of living. People who had guided their own civilization in a direction that valued different things than surface civilization, and who maintained their distance from the world above with great care and effort. Before she could ask any of the many questions that came to her later, He stood up, gave her a nod that she described as formal and deliberate, and walked around the rock outcropping. She followed immediately. He was not there. There was nowhere he could have gone in the time it took her to follow him. The rock dropped away steeply on the other side. There were no other trails. He had simply vanished. Ryden is a credible witness in that she was not someone with a prior interest in Shasta mythology. She wasn't looking for Lemurians. She was just there to hike. Her story doesn't fit neatly into the theosophical framework because she specifically described the man as ordinary and human, not as a member of a spiritually advanced ancient race. His description of his community was practical, almost matter-of-fact. They chose to live underground. They worked to stay hidden. It wasn't mystical. It was a choice made and kept over a very long time. Whether she encountered what she described, and whether she described it accurately, are questions that can't be answered from this distance. But the shape of her story, the sudden meeting, the clear and unembellished information shared, the impossible disappearance, is the same as dozens of other stories spanning more than 100 years. Let's go back further, much further. Before the Spanish missions reached Northern California, before any European contact had changed the native cultures of the region, before the fur trade had brought British and American trappers into the mountains of the Pacific Slope, before all of that, the peoples of Northern California had long, deep relationships with the land. Archaeological work in the Mount Shasta area has been limited. This is partly because of access and funding, and partly because the area is a sacred site for several native nations, which limits the kind of digging that would be most useful. What has been found shows evidence of people living in this region for at least 8,000 to 10,000 years, with some signs suggesting an even earlier presence. What the archaeological record shows is a pattern of settlement that has always treated Mount Shasta itself as something apart. The mountain is surrounded by places where people lived at various distances, but signs of permanent homes on the mountain itself are consistently absent or very few. For most mountains, this would be explained by the high elevation and harsh weather. But Shasta's lower slopes include large areas where living would have been quite possible. The lack of settlement appears to have been a choice, not a practical necessity. This matches what the oral traditions say. The mountain was not a place for everyday life. It was a place for specific, purposeful visits, approached with ceremony and intention. People went to the mountain when they needed to connect with what the mountain represented. They did not live there, but someone apparently did, because scattered within the archaeological record of the region are objects that don't fit the cultural pattern of any known group. Things made from materials not found locally. Stone carved with techniques not seen in any identified regional tradition. Pieces of worked metal in contexts that predate any known metalworking culture in the area. These objects are consistently found in places near the mountain's lower slopes, in the very areas where the oral traditions describe the underground people as sometimes emerging. The academic community has not made a big deal of these oddities. Oddities are uncomfortable. They complicate existing theories. The usual tendency in archaeology is to find ways to fit unusual data into existing models, rather than letting that data challenge the models themselves. This is understandable as a kind of professional caution, but it means that the oddities just pile up in footnotes and extra data tables, rather than being seriously investigated. There's a researcher named William Edwards who spent many years in the late 20th century trying to collect and compare all documented accounts of unusual activity at Mount Shasta. He was an independent researcher, not connected to any university, which gave him the freedom to look at the material without academic restrictions. But it also meant his work lacked the official approval that would make it easy for others to take seriously. His collection ran to several hundred stories, covering the period from the 1850s through the 1990s. He tried to separate the accounts that could be explained by natural causes, by social movements like the I am activity, by simple misidentification, from the accounts that didn't fit those explanations. What remained after he had done his best to filter out the rest was a smaller, but still significant collection of stories that all shared certain features. They took place in the same general areas on the mountain's northern and western faces. They described people who appeared without any traceable approach and who disappeared without any traceable departure. They described sounds and vibrations in places not linked to any known geothermal vents. They described unusual temperatures, pockets of air that were much warmer or cooler than the surrounding area for no obvious geological reason. And they described physical structures, brief glimpses of carved stone or finished surfaces visible through cracks or gaps in the rock. Edwards noticed that these stories clustered in specific zones, not all over the mountain. The most common place was a part of the northern face between about 9,000 and 11,000 feet, a zone that is technically reachable but very hard to get to because of the rough terrain. The second most common area was a section of the western base, below the tree line, near a series of hot springs that geologists have documented. He also noted that many of the accounts came from people who had no connection to the Shasta mystical tradition, who didn't know about the Lemurian story, and so their descriptions were not shaped by that framework. These stories were often more confused and less detailed than those from people who were already part of the tradition, because they had no words to describe what they had seen. But they were also in some ways more useful, because they represented a more direct observation. His work was never published in a way that reached a wide audience. Copies of his manuscript exist in the files of a few researchers who were in touch with him. His conclusion, stated carefully and with appropriate doubt, was that something in the Mount Shasta area was creating consistent, structured experiences in people who had no shared cultural background, and that the simplest explanation for this consistency was that they were, in some form, reporting on a real thing, even if the nature of that thing remained unclear. In the summer of 1931, a series of reports reached the Siskiyou County Sheriff's Office from people living in the small towns around the mountain. The reports were not about strange lights or mysterious sounds. They were about missing people, not exactly missing, but more like people who had been seen heading toward the mountain and who later returned, but came back different. The cases are documented in local newspapers and in some letters that have since been archived. 3 people, in particular, were described in detail. The first was a farmer from east of the mountain who had gone out one morning to check on some damage in his upper field. He was gone for several days. When he came back, he was not hurt, he was not upset, but he would not say where he had been or what had happened. His family and neighbors noticed that he seemed quieter afterward, more thoughtful, less interested in the things that had once filled his days. He lived for another 20 years and never gave a full account of those missing days. The second was a young woman who had been hiking on a trail that goes around the lower slopes. She returned to the trailhead a day later than expected, confused about how much time had passed. She described being in space under the mountain, though she couldn't explain how she had gotten there. She said she had been treated kindly and eventually guided back to the surface. But she couldn't give any specific details. She said it was as if she had been shown enough to know that something was there, but not enough to understand what it was. The third was a man who had gone searching for minerals on the mountain's northern face. He came down after 3 days carrying gold nuggets of a kind that were later described as unusually pure and of a strange mix, suggesting they had been processed rather than found in the ground. He said he had traded for them. He wouldn't say with whom. These stories were treated by local authorities as curiosities rather than as crimes. No one had been hurt. No law had been broken. The strange circumstances were noted and then put away. But the fact that they exist as official records, not just as folklore or rumor, gives them a different weight than most Mount Shasta tales. The hot springs at the base of Mount Shasta are not unusual in themselves. Volcanic places often have hot springs. What is a little unusual about some of the Shasta springs is the chemistry of the water. Certain springs on the lower western slopes have a mineral mix that doesn't match what you would expect from simple geothermal circulation through the local rock. The water seems to have passed through environments that don't show up on the surface. This doesn't have to mean anything strange. Underground water systems are complex. Water can travel long distances through geological layers and pick up unusual minerals along the way. But it does mean that at least some of the water coming out of these springs has been somewhere that isn't obvious from looking at the ground above. Water that has been underground, in a place that leaves no trace on the surface. That is something worth keeping in mind. There is also a collection of observations about magnetic anomalies. Magnetometers used in the area produce readings that don't match what the surface rocks would suggest. Certain places show localized magnetic oddities, areas where the magnetic field is stronger or weaker than the background level. Some of these can be explained by uneven deposits of magnetite-bearing rocks beneath the surface. Others are in places where the surface rocks don't obviously explain them. Magnetic anomalies are one of the tools used for underground mapping. Dense rock, empty spaces, metal deposits, and certain man-made structures all give different magnetic signatures. When the military or government agencies do early surveys for possible underground construction, they often use magnetometry as one of their methods. The presence of unexplained magnetic anomalies in a region doesn't tell you what is causing them, but it does tell you that something is there that isn't obvious from the surface. The Mount Shasta magnetic anomaly data has never been the subject of a published, systematic study. Some of it comes from geological surveys done for other purposes. Some comes from amateur investigators with simple equipment. The data is scattered and uneven, but what exists points toward an underground picture that is more complex than the official geological reports have described. Now we should talk about the people who have tried to go inside, because this is the part of the story that is easiest to document and hardest to make sense of. Throughout the 20th century, a number of individuals made serious, organized attempts to enter the tunnel systems that witnesses had described. Some of these attempts were driven by scientific curiosity, some by spiritual seeking, some by simple adventure. Their accounts share several features that are worth noting. In almost every case, the investigators say they found real cave openings in the areas where the stories were concentrated. Not imagined openings, not wishful thinking, but actual physical openings leading into actual passages. In almost every case, the investigators say the passages they entered came to an end, sometimes after a short distance, sometimes after a longer one. They ended in solid rock, or in drops that couldn't be climbed down, or in narrow passages that became too tight to go through. None of the organized expeditions produced evidence of the huge tunnel systems that the stories described, but several of them produced something else. Accounts of sudden experiences at the point where the passages ended. Feelings of being pushed back that went beyond the physical limit of the passage. A sudden feeling of dizziness, nausea, or headache that vanished completely as soon as the investigators stepped back. In a few cases, there were reports of sounds or lights coming from beyond the point where the passage ended. One investigator, a caver with a lot of experience in California caves, wrote a detailed account of an exploration on the western face in the early 1970s. He had found a large opening, big enough to stand up in, that led into a passage that went about 60 feet before turning sharply. Around the turn, the passage continued for another 40 feet and then seemed to drop. He was moving down toward the drop point when he felt something he described as a wall of force. Not a physical wall, but a feeling that stopped him from moving forward in a way he couldn't explain. He said it was like trying to walk into a wind that had no movement and no temperature. That just stopped him. He backed up. The feeling stopped. He tried again. The feeling came back. He eventually gave up and didn't return to that spot. He was very clear in his account that he was not a mystical person. He had explored hundreds of caves. He had never felt anything like it. He had no explanation. He simply filed it under things that need more study and moved on. Other accounts describe similar feelings. The exact feeling varies. Some describe it as a wave of extreme cold. Some describe it as a kind of mental fog, an inability to think clearly that clears up the moment they step back. Some describe it as a simple, overwhelming feeling of being told no, an impression so strong and immediate that it works like a physical barrier. Taken one by one, any of these stories could be explained by psychological factors. Caves do strange things to people. The mix of darkness, enclosed space, unusual echoes, and a knowledge that you are somewhere very few people have ever been can create experiences that are hard to explain. Low oxygen, carbon dioxide buildup, infrasound from geothermal sources, electromagnetic fields from geological stress, all of these can cause strange perceptions in underground places. But the pattern of where these feelings happen is striking. The accounts of being turned back are found in the same places as the accounts of underground people. The places where investigators report invisible barriers are the same places where witnesses have reported seeing people come out of the mountain. That consistency is not what you would expect if the experiences were purely psychological, caused just by being in a cave. It suggests that there is something about those particular places that is creating those experiences. Let's go underground. Not for real, but in our imagination. Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine you have gone down into the mountain. Not the first few hundred feet that cavers and curious visitors have reached. Much deeper. Deep enough that the rock above you is measured in thousands of feet. Deep enough that the sound of the surface world is just a memory. The temperature at this depth, in volcanic rock with geothermal heat, is not cold. It is warm, not hot, just the kind of warmth that seeps into your bones after a long time in the cold mountain air. The air is moving, slowly, but it is moving. That means this space is connected to something else. The air is circulating from somewhere to somewhere. A completely sealed space would have still air. What about the light? What is the source of the light? Not your headlamp. Imagine you don't have one. The stories from people who describe being inside the mountain always mention light, but they can never say where it is coming from. Bioluminescence is found in many cave environments, produced by fungi, bacteria, and certain types of algae that have adapted to life underground. Large volcanic cave systems often have their own ecosystems precisely because they offer steady temperatures, steady moisture, and in geothermally active areas, a chemical energy source that doesn't depend on sunlight. Could a community, and I use that word carefully, not to mean anything elaborate or advanced, but simply a structured human group, could such a community keep itself alive in a geothermally active volcanic cave system? The answer from basic principles of survival is that it is at least theoretically possible. Geothermal energy can drive chemical reactions that create organic matter. Underground water can provide fresh water. The lack of sunlight is a major obstacle for growing food, but it is not an absolute barrier. Fungi and chemosynthetic organisms can form the base of a food chain that doesn't need the sun. Fire provides extra warmth and light. The difficulties are huge, but they are not impossible to overcome. More than that, there are real, documented cases of people living underground for a long time. The underground cities of Cappadocia in modern Turkey were inhabited continuously for many centuries. They held tens of thousands of people living mostly below the surface, with complex air systems, fresh water, and places to store food. These cities are not just ideas. They have been dug up and studied. People really did live there for many generations, with complex social lives and cultural traditions all under the ground. The Cappadocian example is not exactly the same as what has been suggested for Mount Shasta, but it shows that the idea is not physically impossible. People can and have lived in underground places on a large scale for long periods. The question for Shasta is not whether such a thing is possible in general. The question is whether there is evidence for it in this particular place. There is a collection of writings connected to a theosophical author named Wishar S. Serve, who published a book in 1931 called Lemuria, the Lost Continent of the Pacific. The book is part mythology, part spiritual speculation, and part something harder to classify. Buried inside the elaborate theosophical framework are very detailed descriptions of the Mount Shasta community that have a strange, practical quality. Serve described the underground community as numbering in the hundreds, not the thousands. He said their main activities were farming, learning, and what he called the refinement of consciousness. He described their physical home as a network of rooms linked by tunnels, heated by geothermal energy, lit by a combination of processed bioluminescence and glowing minerals. He described their technology as advanced in some ways, especially in the use of sound and what he called vibratory energy, while being completely absent in areas related to burning fuel or mechanical power. These descriptions are easy to dismiss as 19th century romantic spiritualism dressed up in new clothes, and they may be exactly that. But some researchers have noticed that Serve's physical descriptions, if you strip away the theosophical language, are internally consistent in a way that made-up descriptions often aren't. The practical details fit together. The ecosystem he describes is biologically believable. The technology he gives to the community is the kind of thing a group of people living underground in a geothermal environment for a very long time might actually develop, focusing on things that work in that setting and not developing things that need the open surface world. He also described the community's relationship with the surface world in terms that are more political than mystical. They watched the surface world. They stepped in occasionally when they decided it would help their own interests, which were mainly staying hidden. They were not good guardians in the theosophical sense. They were a small group managing a difficult situation, watching their larger, more powerful neighbors. If you take that framework out of the theosophical language and look at it as a description of how a community in that position might actually act, it makes sense. It explains the rare, careful contact. It explains why they would sometimes share useful information with surface people. It explains why they are so careful to stay hidden. It is not spiritual. It is strategic. In 1987, the same year that Carol Ryden had her experience on the western slope, a different kind of story came out of the area. A group of geology students from a California university were doing field work on the mountain slopes as part of a project to monitor seismic activity. Their work was very ordinary. They were just placing instruments and collecting data for earthquake research. On the second day, while setting up equipment on the northern face at about 10,000 feet, one of the students found an opening in a rock formation that wasn't marked on any of the geological maps they were using. The opening was about 4 feet across, roughly round, and it led into a passage that sloped downward. They were scientists. They looked inside. 2 of the group went into the passage and followed it for about 90 feet before it opened into a large chamber, big enough that their headlamps couldn't reach the far walls. The floor of the room was flat, not the kind of natural flatness you get from sediment building up, but smooth, as if it had been worked by hand or worn down by a very long time of use. On the walls of the room were marks, not random scratches, but organized patterns, lines that made geometric shapes, not pictures or symbols. Geometric figures repeated with a precision that they said was not like anything you could make by carving freehand. They spent about an hour in the room, drawing what they could and taking photographs. Then they went back to the surface and reported their find to their professor by radio. His response was immediate. He told them not to go back in and not to talk about what they had found until they returned to the university. They did as they were told. When they got back, they were told that the photographs had been taken for analysis and that the matter was being reviewed. They never got the photographs back. They were told that the marks had been identified as natural rock formations, a conclusion that at least 2 of the students didn't agree with, based on what they had seen. This account comes from 2 people who were part of that field team. Both have since moved on to careers outside geology. Both gave their accounts separately and consistently to a journalist writing about Mount Shasta in the early 2000s. Neither wanted their name used. Both described the experience as the most professionally uncomfortable of their lives, not because of what they found, but because of how it was handled afterward. The suppression of unusual archaeological and geological findings is not a wild conspiracy theory. It is a known thing. Academic institutions and the people who fund them have strong reasons to avoid findings that complicate the existing picture. Careers are built on that existing picture. The whole system of institutional knowledge is, by its nature, resistant to truly unusual data. This doesn't require anyone to be a villain. It only requires people to act in their own professional interests, which is what people normally do. The result, over many decades and centuries, is a record in which oddities are consistently underreported, filed away, blamed on error, or quietly reclassified. In the Mount Shasta area, with its unusual mix of geological complexity, cultural sensitivity, and a long history of strange reports, is exactly the kind of place where that kind of underreporting would be most likely to happen. What about the people who live there now? Not inside the mountain, but around it. The towns of the Mount Shasta area are small. Mount Shasta, Dunsmuir. They are communities whose whole existence is shaped by being near the mountain. Tourism, outdoor activities, and a steady stream of people looking for spiritual experiences or alternative ways of living. The mountain has always drawn unusual people. That is just a fact about the place. The longtime residents of these towns have their own relationships with the mountain and the stories about it. They are divided. Some find the mystical tradition annoying, a silly addition to what is just a mountain, a resource, a piece of land they have practical connections with. Others are more mixed. People who haven't personally seen anything strange, but who have neighbors and relatives who have, and who aren't sure what to make of that. A smaller group holds what might be called practical belief. Not belief in Lemurians or lost continents. Belief that there's something odd about the mountain that goes beyond what has been officially recorded. These are not dreamy people looking for magic. They are farmers, loggers, builders, people whose connection to the land is real and practical. They have, from time to time, seen things they couldn't explain. They have heard things. They don't have a big story to attach these experiences to. They just know that the mountain is not entirely what it seems. One rancher whose family has worked the land near the mountain for 4 generations put it this way: you live near that mountain long enough, you stop being surprised by surprises. Something happens that you can't explain. You notice it and you keep working. Maybe it all means something, maybe it doesn't, but you don't pretend it didn't happen. That kind of quiet, local, practical witness is in some ways the most believable kind of testimony about the mountain. These are people with no agenda. They're not writing books or looking for an audience. They're just describing what it is like to live near a place that sometimes does things they can't explain. There's a writer named David Hatcher Childress who has spent a lot of time collecting what he calls forbidden archaeology, documented oddities in the archaeological record that don't fit the usual story. His work is controversial in academic circles. His methods are sometimes questioned. His conclusions often go beyond his evidence. But his collection, whatever you think of his interpretation, is very large. And within it, the Mount Shasta section is notable for the number and variety of strange reports it includes. Childress connects the Shasta evidence to a larger pattern of unusual underground structures and ancient civilizations that he thinks existed in pre-Columbian North America on a scale that mainstream archaeology has not accepted. His specific claims about Shasta include the existence of a network of tunnels connecting the mountain to other important geological sites in California and Oregon, the presence of rooms holding objects that are not natural, and the survival of a small human community within the mountain's volcanic structure that has kept going from a time long before European contact. He doesn't prove these things. He collects accounts. He sees patterns. He asks questions, and some of the questions he asks are genuinely interesting. Why, for example, do accounts of unusual underground spaces gather not just around Mount Shasta, but around a series of important geological features stretching from Shasta South through the Sierra Nevada and into the desert Southwest? Why do native oral traditions in many separate cultural groups speak of underground passage networks connecting these same places? Why do the magnetic anomaly profiles of several of these sites share features that suggest similar underground structures? These are questions that deserve investigation, not acceptance. Investigation. The summer of 1965 was a dry one in Northern California. The fire risk was high, and the Forest Service was doing more patrols than usual in the higher parts of the Shasta area. Two rangers on patrol on the northern face came across something that they reported after some debate to their supervisor. They had been following a trail through an old burn area when they saw a man. He was alone. He was sitting on a rock at about 10,500 feet. He didn't seem to be in trouble. He wasn't equipped for a long stay in the wilderness, which is what you would need at that height in a period of high fire risks. He had no backpack, no visible supplies, no gear beyond the clothes he was wearing. The rangers approached. The man greeted them calmly. He spoke clearly and without any accent. He gave them a name that the rangers later tried to track down without success. When they asked where he had come from and where he was going, his answers didn't make practical sense given his location and his lack of equipment. He described himself as a resident of the mountain, not a visitor. A resident. The rangers described the conversation that followed as one of the strangest of their careers. The man spoke in detail about the mountain's geological history, about the tunnel systems beneath it, about the community that used those tunnels. He did this calmly, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world, with no apparent concern for what the rangers might think or do with the information. After about half an hour, he told the rangers that he needed to return now and that he hoped they would take care of themselves and each other. He walked away from them into an area of large rocks. They followed immediately, within seconds, intending to continue the conversation. He was gone. The rocks offered no hiding place that could explain his disappearance at that speed. Both rangers filed a report. The report was noted by their supervisor, who described it as a standard, unusual encounter report, the kind of thing that comes in now and then from field staff working in remote areas. It was not investigated further. It is in a file that is technically accessible through public records requests, though whether it has been indexed in a way that makes it easy to find is another question. Let's talk about time, not geological time, but the kind of time that matters for a hidden civilization. If you're going to live in isolation from the surface world for a very long period, one of your biggest problems would be keeping knowledge alive. Not just practical knowledge about how to survive underground, but the deeper knowledge that gives a civilization its character. History, science, art, the accumulated understanding of who you are and where you came from. Underground groups in other parts of the world have dealt with this through careful systems of record keeping. The Cappadocian cities kept written records. The underground monks of various traditions kept libraries. Preserving knowledge in an isolated underground setting requires careful, ongoing effort. The accounts linked to Mount Shasta describe exactly this. Many witnesses who spoke with people they believed were from the underground community reported that these individuals had a remarkably wide range of knowledge. Not just practical knowledge, but historical knowledge. Knowledge about the surface world that went far beyond what someone cut off from that world should have. Knowledge about things that happened far from the mountain at different times in history. This suggests, if the stories are taken at face value, an active effort to watch the surface world, to gather and keep knowledge about events and developments in the larger world, while staying carefully separate from it. A watching brief, the behavior of a small, isolated group that knows it is surrounded by something much larger and keeps its own identity by knowing as much as possible about what is around it. This makes strategic sense. It is the behavior of a clever group in a weak position. Watch, learn, act rarely, and carefully keep the distance that allows survival. The question of why a community would keep up this kind of isolation for so long, possibly for hundreds of years, is an interesting one. The Cappadocian cities were built as places of refuge, mainly from religious persecution and military attacks. The people who built them went underground because the surface was not safe. Over time, the underground world became home, became their culture, became their whole world. The reason for staying changed from fear to identity. Something like that process would be the most natural explanation for a long-term underground community. A group that originally went underground for safety, maybe during a time of great disruption on the surface, and over many generations developed a culture that was adapted to and identified with its underground home, so that now they stay separate not mainly out of fear, but out of identity. We are not surface people. We are the people of the inside. That is who we are. The Cascades, the volcanic range that includes Mount Shasta, are not the only place in North America where there are old stories of people living underground. Such stories are actually quite widespread, though they are not well integrated into the usual story of pre-Columbian North America. The Hopi have oral traditions about their ancestors coming out of an underground world through a sipapu, an opening in the earth at the beginning of the current age. This is usually treated as religious myth. But the Hopi also speak of real places in the American Southwest where the previous world can still be reached. Places where the boundary between the underground world and the surface world is thin. These places are not vague. They are specific enough that people have gone looking for them, and have sometimes found cave systems in those places that show signs of long use by people. The ancestral Puebloans, whose civilization in the American Southwest remains one of the great puzzles of archaeology, built large networks of underground kivas, ceremonial rooms, some of which connected to tunnel systems whose full length has never been mapped. The ancestral Puebloans also disappeared. They didn't slowly fade away in the way that archaeological cultures usually do. They stopped using their surface homes with a suddenness that has never been fully explained. The main explanation is drought. Drought certainly played a part, but drought alone doesn't explain why a sophisticated people with a long history of adapting to difficult conditions would simply abandon their way of life instead of changing it. Unless they changed it in a direction that archaeology hasn't followed. Unless some of them went somewhere else, and somewhere else was down, not away. The traditions of many southwestern people speak of certain groups leaving in the direction of the underground. Not dying, but leaving. A deliberate move to a world that already existed beneath the surface. A world that was connected to the surface world through certain passages. A world that some people knew how to enter and some did not. These traditions are not exactly the same as the Mount Shasta accounts, but they share a similar shape. An underground world, a community that lives there, passages connecting the underground to the surface. Careful, limited contact between the two worlds. A tradition of knowledge and culture kept alive in isolation. The distance between the American Southwest and Northern California is big, but it is not so big as to make connection impossible. Pre-Columbian North America was not the empty, isolated place that early European accounts made it seem. Trade networks stretched from the Pacific coast to the Gulf of Mexico. Information and goods and people moved across the continent through systems that we are still only beginning to understand. An underground network connecting important volcanic and geologically active places across the western half of the continent is not impossible on the face of it. It is ambitious. It would take very strong evidence to prove. But it is not physically impossible in the way that, say, a sunken continent is. In the 1990s, a series of maps began to appear among the community of people interested in Mount Shasta. The maps were said to show the underground structure of the area, the tunnels, the rooms, the connection points. They were attributed to various sources. Some were said to be based on native oral traditions. Some were said to be from eyewitness accounts. Some were said to come from documents obtained through Freedom of Information requests. None of these maps has been proven to be genuine. None of them has been shown to match any verified underground features. They are shared as documents of unclear origin, and they probably tell us more about the community of people who are interested in Mount Shasta than they do about the mountain itself. But there is something interesting about the pattern of the underground features they show, which is remarkably consistent across maps that claim different sources. The main tunnel entrances are shown in roughly the same places on the different versions. The room layouts, while different in detail, have similar overall shapes. The connection points to other important geological features appear in similar positions. If these maps were made up by different people, you would expect more variation. The consistency could mean they all come from a single source, one person who made them and sent them out under different names. Or it could mean that the different maps are based on the same underlying stories, which happen to be consistent because they are describing the same real thing. The maps can't tell us which explanation is right, but they are one more example of the consistency that runs through the Mount Shasta evidence. Different sources, different times, different cultural backgrounds, all pointing toward the same general picture. There is a road that winds up the side of Mount Shasta, ending at a parking lot at about 7,000 feet. From there, trails go up onto the mountain and out across its sides. The mountain draws hikers, climbers, spiritual seekers, curious visitors. On a busy summer weekend, the parking lot fills up. The people who come for the hiking mostly experience the mountain as a mountain. Beautiful, challenging, sometimes dangerous because of the weather that can build up around it without warning. They come down happy and talk about the views. But there are always a few who come down with something else. A feeling that the mountain is not just what it appears to be. That the rock faces above the trail and the slopes below are somehow more than just geological features. That the occasional sound from below, the faint vibration through the soles of their boots, the change in temperature in certain places where there should be no such change, all add up to something that the geological maps don't explain. These people don't always talk about it. The weight of the Mount Shasta mystical tradition makes it easy to dismiss them, and they know it. If you say you felt something strange on Mount Shasta, people will assume you are a Lemurian believer before you finish your sentence. The tradition has taken over the way people talk about these things. It is hard to give a simple, honest account of an unusual observation without having it swallowed up by the mythology. This is one of the real costs of the Lemurian overlay. It has made careful, honest reporting of genuine, unusual experiences very difficult. The stigma attaches before the story is even finished. So people who have real experiences that they don't understand and have tried to think about carefully and honestly often end up saying nothing or saying very little to very few people, because the alternative is to be labeled in a way that ends the conversation. The people who saw the lights on the slope in 1932, the people who heard the vibrations in 1897, the geology students in 1987, the rangers in 1965, the rancher whose family has worked the land for 4 generations. These are not Lemurian enthusiasts. They are people who observed something, noted it, and filed it away somewhere in their memory without having the words to describe it that wouldn't be misunderstood. The mountain deserves better witnesses, and the witnesses deserve better ways to be heard. As we move closer to the present, the collection of evidence about Mount Shasta has not gotten smaller. If anything, the number of accounts has grown, partly because the internet has given people who once would have stayed quiet a way to connect with others who share their experiences. The quality of that evidence is mixed. The internet has also made it easier to create and spread elaborate fakes. And the Mount Shasta subject attracts a community of people whose relationship with evidence is not always careful. Separating a genuine account from a made-up one in online spaces is genuinely hard. The tools that help with that separation, confirmation from independent sources, documentary proof, consistent geography, and cultural independence of the witness, are all harder to use in an online setting. What does persist, even the noisier modern record, is the pattern of clustering. The accounts, even the modern ones, still gather in the same places on the mountain. The experiences described still have the same core features. The witnesses, even when they are anonymous internet users, describe experiences that are consistent with what witnesses wrote in local newspapers 100 years ago. This is either because the modern accounts are influenced by the historical ones, because people who go looking for the Mount Shasta experience find what they expect to find, or it is because the underlying thing, whatever it is still there and is still creating the same kinds of experiences in the people who come across it. The problem is that those two explanations produce the same visible result. Consistent accounts. We can't tell them apart without being inside the experience itself. In the early 2000s, a former employee of the United States Forest Service who had worked in the Shasta Trinity National Forest for several years gave a long account to a freelance journalist. He asked not to be identified. His account covered several kinds of unusual experiences during his time working in the area. The most important part of his story concerned a zone on the northern face of the mountain, above where the usual hiking trails go, that he described as a restricted area not shown on any public map. During his years working in the area, he had been told informally by older colleagues about this zone. The briefing was not official. It was the kind of thing passed from experienced employee to new hire as practical knowledge about the area. Don't go there. Don't ask about it. If visitors get too close, steer them away. He said he followed these instructions without question for several years, assuming the restricted area was something to do with geological danger or administrative access rights. It was only when he tried to look up the official paperwork for the restriction and found that no such paperwork existed in the public record that he started to question what the restriction was really about. He sent an internal query about the area's status. He got a reply that acknowledged the restriction but described it as an informal practice related to research work. He was not given any details. When he asked for more details, he was moved to a different area. He didn't push the matter further at that time. When he gave his account to the journalist, he was no longer working for the Forest Service. He wasn't angry or upset. He described himself as curious and as having spent a lot of time since his Forest Service days try to understand what the restriction had been about. His conclusion was that something in that zone was being protected from casual discovery, and that the protection was organized and deliberate, even if it wasn't formally documented. He didn't know what was being protected. He had not personally seen anything in the zone that explained the restriction. He was just a person who had been told not to go somewhere, who had not been given a good reason, and who had eventually decided that was worth talking about. Let me ask you something directly. If there were an underground community in the Mount Shasta area, a small group of people who had lived in isolation from the surface world for a very long time, what would we expect to see? We would expect to see exactly what we do see. We would expect to see oral traditions among the people who live closest to the mountain describing the existence of such a community. We would expect to see occasional meetings between surface people and community members, meetings that the surface people found hard to explain and that they described using whatever framework their culture provided. We would expect to see physical evidence that was fragmentary and hard to interpret without specific knowledge of what to look for. We would expect to see unusual geological and geophysical data in the relevant area that was blamed on ordinary causes because the investigators didn't have the right ideas to interpret it. We would expect to see a pattern of discouragement around exploration in the relevant areas, not necessarily through direct suppression, but through the kind of institutional inertia that turns attention away from awkward oddities. And we would expect to see the real evidence tangled up with elaborate cultural stories that make it very hard to judge on its own terms. We see all of these things. That is not proof. The same pattern could be produced by a very interesting mix of geology, cultural tradition, and people seeing patterns in an unusual landscape. These things happen. Humans are pattern-seeking creatures in a world full of patterns. We find what we look for, sometimes even when it isn't there. But it is also worth noting that the same skeptical argument that should make us cautious about accepting the evidence also applies to dismissing it. It is easy to dismiss the Mount Shasta evidence because the weight of the Lemurian tradition makes the subject seem silly. But that dismissal is itself a motivated action, motivated by the desire to avoid being associated with something that looks ridiculous. That is not a good reason to dismiss evidence. The honest position is uncertainty. There is something genuinely unusual about the Mount Shasta area. What that something is, we don't know. The most extreme explanation, a long-standing underground human community, would explain more of the evidence than any other single idea. It would not require the evidence to be made up or misremembered or blamed on natural things through wishful thinking. It would just require that something be true that we haven't officially confirmed. That is not a comfortable place to be. Humans don't like real uncertainty. We want an answer. We want the story to come out either true or false. But sometimes the honest answer is that the evidence is real, the explanation is unclear, and the investigation is incomplete. Mount Shasta is not resolved. It is open. There is a way of looking at things that some researchers have started to use on the Mount Shasta question that is worth describing. It comes from the field of landscape archaeology, which looks at how human communities shape and are shaped by the physical environment they live in. Landscape archaeologists argue that a community that has lived in a place for a very long time leaves marks that are different from the marks left by shore occupation. The community doesn't just use the landscape, it becomes part of it. The landscape becomes part of the community's identity and memory. Features of the landscape that might look completely natural to an outside observer become, on closer look, organized, named, maintained, applied to the Mount Shasta area. This way of thinking suggests looking not at the big dramatic claims, but at the wider pattern of the landscape. Are there features that look natural but show signs of long-term organization? Are there areas that appear in many separate accounts as important, but that have no obvious natural feature to attract attention? Are there places that the native traditions mention again and again in context that suggest they are not just scenic, but have a practical use? When researchers have used this lens on the available data from Mount Shasta, the result is a map of the mountain's lower slopes that has an organized quality that is not entirely explained by the geology. Certain areas keep appearing in accounts as important. The same places that are mentioned in Wintu oral tradition also appear in prospector accounts from the 1880s, in 20th century encounter reports, and the landscape archaeologist's analysis of features that seem organized rather than random. This is not proof of anything, but it is a method that takes the evidence seriously without jumping to conclusions. It says if there is something here to find, this is where to look. And it points to specific places with a consistency that suggests the pointing is real, even if what is being pointed at remains unclear. It is almost morning now. Not really, but in the feeling of a long night spent thinking about difficult questions, we're getting to the point where you need to decide what you take with you and what you leave behind. The Mount Shasta mystery is not a neat thing. It is not resolved into a simple answer. What it does do is show us something about the nature of knowledge, and in the nature of the landscape we live in, and in the nature of the past that lies under the present. The Americas before European contact were not the empty, sparsely populated lands that people often imagine. They were densely inhabited, carefully organized, deeply understood by the people who lived there. That understanding was organized differently from the way Western science organizes things. It was kept in oral tradition, in ceremony, in relationships with specific places that were kept alive over very long periods of time. Most of that understanding was destroyed or broken by what happened after 1492. What survived did so in forms that are hard for outsiders to access and easy for outsiders to misunderstand. The Mount Shasta traditions are part of that surviving understanding. The Wintu, the Modoc, the Akamawi, the Karuk knew this mountain. They knew it for thousands of years. What they said about it was based on that long relationship. When they described underground inhabitants, they were not being metaphorical. They were reporting what they understood to be a real feature of the world they lived in. We don't have to accept their description without question, but we have to take it seriously. We have to try to understand it on its own terms before we decide that it doesn't mean what it says. The geophysical anomalies are real. They have been measured. They don't have satisfying explanations. The archaeological oddities are real. They have been documented, even if incompletely. The pattern of encounters described by separate witnesses across more than a century is real. The way those encounters are clustered in certain places is real. The institutional pattern of discouraging investigation is real. What is also real is our uncertainty about what all of this means. That uncertainty is not a reason to stop looking. It is a reason to look more carefully with better tools, with more careful methods, with the honesty to report what is found without filtering it through ideas that make it impossible to see clearly. Somewhere in the tunnels beneath the mountain, if they exist, there are people who have been living in a different relationship with the world than any of us have ever known. People who measure time differently, who understand the inside of the earth in ways that no academic discipline has yet put into words, who have watched the surface world change around them without being changed by it. Or they're not. Either answer is extraordinary. The first is extraordinary in obvious ways. The second is extraordinary because it means that 150 years of consistent, separate, geographically clustered stories have been pointing at nothing. That the native traditions of many separate peoples have preserved fiction about the mountain that happens to match the fictional accounts of miners and mystics and forest rangers and geology students. That the geophysical oddities are all explained by ordinary geology. That the archaeological oddities are all the result of poor methods. That the institutional discouragement of investigation is just a coincidence. That the people who felt they were turned back from underground passages were all having psychological reactions to being in caves at the very same places. That is a lot of coincidences to accept. The mountain stands 14,000 feet and more. It stands alone above the land around it, drawing people to it, creating experiences in those people that they can't explain in ordinary terms. It has been doing this for as long as there have been people near it. That is the thing about Mount Shasta that is most consistent across every kind of evidence. The mountain does something to people who come near it. Not everyone, not all the time, but regularly across every kind of person, every cultural background, every level of prior belief. The mountain creates experiences that the people who have them find genuinely hard to explain. What is inside it? What is beneath it? What is keeping? We don't know. But we should keep looking. There is one more kind of story that deserves its place in this record. These are stories from people who are not looking for anything. People who had no knowledge of the Mount Shasta tradition, no interest in the Lemurian story, no spiritual seeking, no academic interest in ancient civilizations. People who happened to be in the area for perfectly ordinary reasons and who had an experience that they still can't explain. A truck driver who pulled over on Route 97 to sleep and was woken by a sound that seemed to come from under the road. A sound like machinery, rhythmic, regular, not natural. He lay there for a few minutes listening. It stopped. He drove on. He didn't tell anyone for 20 years, until he read an article about the mountain and suddenly had a context for what he had heard. A woman who moved to Weed, a small town at the mountain's base, for a job that had nothing to do with the mountain, and who found over several years that she would sometimes wake at night with a strong sense of movement under the house. Not earthquake movement, slower, more deliberate. She mentioned her neighbors and was told calmly that this happened to some people in Weed. It was just a mountain. She never learned more than that. A group of teenagers who went camping on the lower slopes one summer night and described their tent being lit up from below, from the ground itself, for about 15 minutes in the middle of the night. Not reflected light, not a flashlight from outside, light from the ground. When they dug at that spot the next morning, they found ordinary soil. Whatever had made the light left no trace. These stories don't come from seekers. They come from people who are just living their lives near something that occasionally reminded them, through direct experience, that the ordinary explanation might not be complete. The mountain has been reminding people this for a very long time. We began with the image of the mountain standing alone, 14,179 feet above the land of Northern California, standing apart from its range in a way that looks almost deliberate, almost placed. The people who knew this mountain best, who spent the most time in its presence across the longest period, consistently described it as exactly that. Not random geology, but a place, a presence, something that had intention in the way a person has intention. Not the same kind of intention, but intention nonetheless. The mountain knows you are there. The mountain responds to you. The mountain has been responding to the people near it for as long as there have been people near it. The science of that is beginning to be understood. Volcanic mountains in geothermally active areas do produce complex effects on the electromagnetic field, on the sound environment, on the visual environment under certain conditions. The mountain is not alive in any literal sense, but it is active in ways that create real effects on living beings that spend time near it. Some of those effects are well understood, some are not. The mystery of what is inside the mountain, what might be beneath it, what the pattern of encounter stories across a century and a half might be pointing toward. That mystery sits at the meeting point of geology and archaeology and cultural history, and the simple, irreducible fact of human experience. People have been having experiences near and on this mountain that don't fit the official description of what the mountain is. Either those experiences are real observations of a real thing, or they represent something equally interesting. A long-lasting, cross-cultural, multi-generational shared encounter with an environment that creates consistent responses in human nervous systems through ways we don't fully understand. Both of those possibilities are worth investigating seriously. Neither of them is resolved. The investigation is not complete. The tunnels, if they exist, are not mapped. The rooms, if they exist, are not documented. The community, if it exists, has not made itself known in a way the surface world has been able to confirm. But something is there. The mountain stands, and in the rock beneath it, something continues. Something old, something patient, something that has been waiting, if waiting is the right word, for the surface world to develop the ability and the honesty to look at it without flinching. We're not there yet, but the mountain isn't going anywhere, and neither, it seems, is whatever the mountain is keeping. If this journey through the hidden spaces beneath Mount Shasta helped your mind wander gently while the night settled around you, that is exactly what these stories are for. You can tap the like button if you would like more stories like this. Explorations that go deep into mountains, into mysteries, into the parts of history that the official record hasn't quite figured out what to do with yet. Subscribe if you want to be here when the next one comes. I would love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight. Leave a comment if you feel like it. Your city, your country, just the word listening if that is all you have. There's a quiet kind of connection in knowing how many different places are joined by the same story at the same moment in the same gentle glow of screen in the dark. For those who want to support the channel further, the membership option is here and completely optional. These long, careful journeys take time, and every bit of support helps make sure there's always another one waiting when you need it. For now, you don't need to do anything at all. Just let it settle. The mountain is still out there in the dark. 14,000 feet of volcanic rock with whatever holds inside it, standing alone, patient, keeping its secrets for one more night. Rest well. The mysteries will still be there in the morning. Good night. Let's stay with the mountain a little longer. There's more to say. The question that keeps coming back, the one that sits beneath all the others, like the mountain itself sits beneath the land around it, is the question of how something lasts. How does a community, a tradition, a body of knowledge survive unchanged across centuries of change in the surface world above it? The surface world changes all the time. Empires rise and fall. Languages change and die. Peoples are moved and lost. The technologies that define one century are useless in the next. The ways that one generation understands the world are almost nothing like the ways of a generation 200 years before it. Change is the main feature of surface life. It is fast, it is constant, and it is often destructive. Underground, things are different, not in every way. People underground face the same basic problems that people everywhere face. They get older. They die. They have children who don't always share their parents' values. They argue. They disagree. They form different groups. The social life of a small, isolated group is not simpler than that of a large surface group. In some ways, it is more intense because the cost of social failure is higher when you can't just leave. But the physical world underground is stable in a way that the surface world is not. The temperature in a geothermally heated cave system doesn't change with the seasons. The water from an underground supply doesn't go up and down with the rain on the surface. The food sources in a geothermal ecosystem don't move with the seasons. The rhythms that drive so much of the change in surface life, the turning of the seasons, the changing climate, the movement of food sources that follows those cycles. These rhythms don't reach underground the same way. If you take away from human life the constant need to adapt to changing surroundings, you make room for something else. More room for improving existing knowledge. More room for developing deep skill in specific areas. More room for keeping traditions alive across generations without the pressure of outside disruption. The surface world's strength is variety and fast change. The underground group's possible strength is depth and continuity. Different ways of meeting the same basic challenge of keeping a human society going across time. It is worth thinking about what a society that values depth and continuity above all else might actually look like. It would probably be small. Small groups can keep their identity in ways that large groups cannot. It would probably be specialized. With limited numbers, you can't afford to have many people doing the same job. Everyone has a role, and the role matters. It would probably be very old, not in the sense of primitive, but in the sense of carrying genuinely old knowledge, gathered over very long periods without the interruption that comes from big outside changes. And it would probably seem strange to outsiders, deliberately strange. Strange in the way that a group that has kept its separation for a long time would seem to someone from the surface world. The strangeness is not about being less developed, but about being deeply different. A different set of values, a different relationship with time, a different understanding of what counts as useful knowledge, a different way of being in the physical world. The witnesses who describe meetings with people from inside the mountain always note this difference. Not inferiority, not superiority, just difference. A meeting across a cultural gap, so wide that the usual tools for understanding cultural difference don't work. You can't assume shared references. You can't assume shared time frames. You can't assume shared ideas of what is important. What you can do is listen carefully to what is actually being said and let it mean what it means without immediately translating it into something more familiar. The mountain's sacred geography deserves more attention than it usually gets in accounts of the Shasta mystery. Sacred geography is the organized understanding of a landscape in terms of spiritual meaning. It is not random. It is not simple superstition. It is the result of careful, long observation of a landscape, kept in forms that preserve the information across generations. Sacred geography says this place is important in this way. This place should be approached with this kind of care. This place connects to this kind of experience. The sacred geography of the Mount Shasta area has kept the traditions of the people who developed that geography over thousands of years is very detailed. Specific places on and around the mountain are connected to specific kinds of experience. The connections are not vague. They're not just this place is holy. They are specific. This is where certain kinds of knowledge can be found. This is where meeting certain kinds of beings is possible. This is where the line between the underground world and the surface world is thin. The specificity matters. General respect for a mountain is common in many cultures. You take a dramatic, isolated volcanic peak, and people will respect it. That is not unusual. What is unusual about the Shasta geography is its practical character. It is not just that the mountain is sacred. It is that specific places on the mountain do specific things. It reads less like religious feeling and more like a useful map. A useful map suggests useful knowledge. Knowledge gained through experience. Knowledge about what actually happens in those places, observed over enough time to be certain. The Winta didn't develop the idea that people come from inside the mountain by making it up. They developed it because over the generations, people did come from inside the mountain. The observation built up. The tradition grew around the observation. The tradition kept the observation alive through the generations that followed. This is how oral tradition works when it is doing its job. It is not myth in the sense of imaginative stories with no basis in fact. It is knowledge management. It is the keeping of observed facts in a form that can be passed down without writing. using stories as the container. The story carries the information. The information is real. Reading native oral traditions with this understanding changes what you see in them. Instead of looking for the myth to see through to an underlying historical event, you look for the practical content. What are they actually saying happened? What useful knowledge is hidden in the story? When to describe the people from inside the mountain, strip the story around it. The practical content is there are people who come out from under the surface of this mountain in certain places. They've been seen doing this. They know things that surface people do not know. They interact carefully and for a reason. That is a description of a real thing. Whether everything else in the tradition around, it is also factually true or not. The first serious attempt to use modern geological survey tools on the Mount Shasta underground question is said to have happened in the late 1980s, carried out by a private research group that has never been publicly identified. The story of this survey comes from one source, a researcher who was loosely connected to the group and who spoke to a journalist in the early 2000s. According to this account, the group used ground-penetrating radar, magnetometers, and seismic profiling to map the underground structure of the mountain's lower slopes over several weeks. The survey was done without official permission, which limited the area they could cover and the depth they could reach. What the survey found, according to this account, was an underground picture much more complex than the official geological record describes. The ground-penetrating radar showed many empty spaces at depth from a few meters down to the limit of what the instrument could see. Some of these spaces had the irregular shape of natural features. Others had boundaries that were more regular, more organized than natural features usually are. The magnetometers showed a pattern of odd readings that didn't match the distribution of magnetic minerals that the surface rocks would suggest. The odd readings were grouped in the same areas that showed empty spaces on the radar. The seismic profiling was the most interesting. When small control blasts were used to create seismic waves and the reflections were studied, the data showed boundaries at depth that suggested not just empty spaces, but changes between materials with very different physical properties. The specific reading was consistent with the boundary between natural rock and a more uniform material, possibly worked stone or packed earth. The group was not able to finish its survey before it was approached by Forest Service workers and told to stop. They did as they were asked. The data they had collected was studied over the following months, and the study apparently produced results important enough that the group chose to keep them private instead of publishing them. The source who described the survey did not know the results. He only knew that the data was considered too important to release. This account is, like most of the important accounts in the Mount Shasta record, impossible to check from outside. There is no written evidence of the survey. The group that did it is not named. The results are unknown. It exists only in the story of one person who was on the edge of it, but it fits the wider pattern. Technical investigation that produces unusual results. Unusual results that are kept quiet rather than published. A record that exists only in stories rather than in documents. If this pattern happened only once, it would be easy to dismiss as a mistake or a lie. Happening many times with different investigators, different times, different methods, the pattern itself becomes data. Not proof of any specific thing, but data about the relationship between the Mount Shasta area and the institutional systems that are supposed to create knowledge about it. The sound environment of the Mount Shasta area has been studied in a limited way by researchers interested in how volcanic landscapes affect sound. Volcanic areas create unusual sound conditions for several reasons. The uneven surfaces of lava flows scatter sound in complex ways. Geothermal features create constant low noise that can cover or interfere with other sounds. Underground spaces, Even those with small openings can act as echo chambers that make certain sounds louder or change them in other ways. Some researchers have suggested that being near certain geological features can change a person's state of mind through sound. Infrasound, sound at frequencies lower than humans can normally hear, is created by many natural sources, including volcanic and geothermal activity. Infrasound at certain levels and strengths affect the human body in ways that have been documented, including creating feelings of unease or unusual perceptions. Research by acoustic engineer Vic Tandy and others has shown that infrasound at about 18.9 Hz can make the human eyeball vibrate, causing strange sights at the edges of vision, blurry lines, and the appearance of movement in still objects. Applied to the Mount Shasta situation, this way of thinking suggests that some of the unusual experiences people report near the mountain, especially the feeling of a presence, the strange sights at the edges of vision, the feeling of being watched or of being in a place where normal rules don't apply, could be caused by infrasound from geothermal sources. The places where these experiences happen would correspond to places where the underground sound environment produces the right frequencies at the surface. This is only a partial explanation at best. It explains some features of some reports. It does not explain the physical meetings with specific people. It does not explain the archaeological oddities. It does not explain the geophysical survey data. But it is an example of the kind of cause that could be part of the experience without requiring any strange ideas. And it is worth including in a complete account. The sound environment of the mountain is real. Its effects on human perception are real and can be measured. Any full account of the Mount Shasta phenomenon needs to include this side of things, rather than treating the human experience reports as simple windows on a physical reality. But it also needs to include the reports that can't be reduced to sound effects, the accounts of physical meetings, the documented objects, the geophysical oddities, the way the accounts group together in the same places across separate witnesses separated by decades. These things don't disappear when you explain them with sound. In 2008, a researcher named Joanna Martinez, who was working toward a doctorate in cultural anthropology at a California university, spent several months in the Mount Shasta area doing interviews for a project on the survival of non-mainstream spiritual beliefs in modern American communities. Her project was not about the tunnels. It was about the I Am activity and other spiritual groups that had grown up around the mountain over the years. In the course of her interviews, she came across something she had not expected, which took her work in a direction she had not planned. She found, hidden inside the stories of people who were mostly associated with the established spiritual groups, accounts of experiences that those people specifically said were separate from their spiritual beliefs. Experiences they were reluctant to talk about in the context of the mountain's mystical reputation, precisely because they wanted the accounts to be taken seriously, and they knew that the mystical association would prevent that. What these people described consistently and with visible discomfort was a meeting, a physical meeting with people who came out of the mountain and who spoke with them briefly before going back in. Not visions, not spiritual experiences, but actual physical meetings with real people who seemed to come from inside the mountain and then go back. The reluctance to discuss these stories within the spiritual tradition was significant. These were people who had arranged their whole lives around a spiritual connection with Mount Shasta. They believed in its spiritual importance deeply and honestly. And yet, when it came to describing their actual meetings with the underground community, they used a different tone, a more literal, more physical, more ordinary tone, because they wanted to make it clear that what they were describing was not a spiritual experience. It was a physical one, a real person, a real conversation, a real disappearance afterwards. Martinez's dissertation touched on these accounts, but did not make them central to her argument. because her dissertation was about spiritual belief, not about the physical reality of what the mountain contained. She has since described the encounter stories as among the most important things she collected during her fieldwork, and as something she has been unsure how to deal with professionally, because the stories point toward a conclusion that her academic framework does not provide the tools to address. She is not alone in that situation. Many researchers who have spent serious time with the Mount Shasta evidence find themselves in the same position. The tools they have are not enough for the thing they have come across. The frameworks they have been trained in do not have categories for what they are looking at. And keeping their jobs means staying within those frameworks, which means putting the unusual data aside rather than letting it change the result. That is the deepest problem in this area of inquiry. Not lies, not wishful thinking, not the Lemurian story. The deepest problem is that the institutions that should be looking into this phenomenon are not able to look into it honestly, because honest looking leads to conclusions that those institutions have no way to handle. The mountain is geologically young compared to the land around it. Much of the surrounding area is much older, shaped by processes that happened before Shasta existed. This means the mountain was built on top of a landscape that already had its own structure, its own geological history, its own cave systems, its own underground water flows. When the volcanic activity that made Shasta began, it did not wipe out the underground structure that was already there. It built on top of it. The lava flows that make up the mountain were laid down on top of ground that already had its own underground features. Those older features were not necessarily destroyed by the volcanic activity. In some cases, they would have been sealed or filled in. In others, the lava would have flowed around them, leaving empty spaces intact underneath. This means the underground structure of the area around Shasta is a layered thing. Many layers of geological history, each with its own network of passages and rooms, laid over each other and sometimes connected by processes that happen where the layers meet. The complexity of the structure is not something that can be fully understood from the surface. What it means in practice is that the cave systems you can reach from the mountain surface are not the only underground spaces in the area. They're the top layer. Below them are older formations that were there before the mountain. Below those are even older ones. The possible depth and extent of the underground structure is much greater than what surface investigation has shown. If there is a community living in these underground spaces, they have potentially had access to a much larger area than the mountain surface shape would suggest. The mountain is the entry point, the actual space underground, if the geological analysis is right, extends well beyond the mountain's outline. This might explain the stories of tunnel networks connecting the mountain to other important geological features in the area. If the underground structure is a connected network rather than a set of separate features, then moving through that network from one surface entry point to another would not require going across the surface at all. You could go underground near Shasta and come out at a place many miles away without ever showing yourself on the surface in between. The oral traditions of the Akamawi and other peoples of the area describe exactly this. A network of underground passages connecting many important places. The ability to travel distances underground that would be much longer on the surface. The existence of communities at many points in this network, not just under Shasta. This is a picture of a regional underground society rather than a single isolated group, which would change the question of how such a society keeps itself going. Because a network of communities can share resources and knowledge in ways that a single isolated group cannot. It also changes the question of size. A single group of hundreds might struggle to survive for centuries. A network of communities across a region might keep a society of thousands alive for thousands of years. The oldest stories are sometimes the most accurate, not in every detail, not in the literal meaning of every part of the story, but in the basic shape of what they are describing. The oldest stories linked to the mountain, kept in the oral traditions of the people who lived closest to it over the longest time, describe the mountain as a place where the earth opens, where people come out from inside, where knowledge passes between worlds. This description is simple. It does not need a big spiritual framework to contain it. It is a description of something seen. The most recent accounts from the 20th and 21st centuries describe the same thing in different words. People coming from inside the mountain, knowledge being shared, a community living below. The words are different because the cultural background are different. The account is the same. That sameness across different cultural backgrounds, across generations, across centuries, is the thing that resists easy explanation. Cultural traditions are conservative. They keep things. They do not usually make up new things from nothing and then keep that invention perfectly unchanged across generations and in big cultural changes. What they keep is what they saw. What they saw was real. The mountain is real. The geological complexity under it is real. The long presence of people near it is real. The sameness of what that presence has reported across all of its documented history is real. Whether or not the underground community is real, whether or not the tunnels are real in the way that physical tunnels are real, something about this place has created something consistent in the people who have spent time near it over a very long time. That something is worth taking seriously, not because it is easy or convenient to do so, but because the alternative is to look at the evidence and decide that all of it means nothing, that all of it is mistakes and lies and wishful thinking, that there is nothing here to find. And that conclusion, the easy one, requires us to make assumptions about how reliable human observation is, how stable oral tradition is, and how institutions deal with unusual information that are harder to defend than the alternative. The alternative is simpler. Something is there. We do not know exactly what. The investigation is not finished. We should keep going. The light that witnesses describe coming from inside the mountain, from cracks in rock, from ground-level vents, from openings that seem to appear and disappear, is one of the most often reported features of the Shasta experience. Light from below has a certain quality that witnesses often note. It does not behave like reflected light. Reflected light, even from a strong source, scatters as it bounces from surface to surface. The light described near Shasta is described as directed. It comes from a specific place and keeps its character across the space it lights up. It is not like a campfire scene through trees. It is like a window, a focused beam from a source with a purpose. Bioluminescence is one natural way that light can be made underground. The cave systems of New Zealand, for example, create beautiful light shows from the glowing larvae of a certain type of gnat. Cave fungi can produce visible light in some places. Some minerals can store and release light after being exposed to radiation. But the light witnesses describe near Shasta does not match the look of bioluminescence. It is too focused, too bright. It does not have the soft blue-green color of most biological light. The witnesses describe it as warm in color, sometimes almost golden, sometimes more neutral. If the underground world is inhabited, artificial light is a necessity. A group living underground for a long time would develop whatever light sources were available. Geothermal chemistry can provide possibilities. Certain chemical reactions can give off steady light, improving the available natural light sources over a very long time. Using whatever the environment provides could, in theory, create something that looks focused and directed from the outside without being electric in the modern sense. The light is not proof of people living there. It is one more feature of the Shasta environment that does not have a fully satisfying ordinary explanation, and that is consistent with the idea of an underground human presence. We have been inside this story for a long time now, long enough that the shape of it has become familiar. The structure of meeting, observation, dismissal by institutions, persistence of the story, grouping in certain places, consistency across cultures. These are the bones of the story. The details are different each time. Different witnesses, different times, different cultural backgrounds, but the bones are the same. That sameness is the most important thing about the Mount Shasta evidence. Not any single account, not any one object or geological reading. The sameness across the whole body of evidence over the whole period of documented observation. Something about this mountain is doing something to the people who come near it, creating the same kinds of experiences in people who have no connection to each other across 150 years of recorded stories, creating the same grouping of unusual reports from witnesses with no link to one another, keeping the same basic shape of meeting as the oral traditions that came before the written record by thousands of years. This is not what you would expect from a mountain that is just a mountain. It is what you would expect from a mountain that is also something else, something that has been there for a very long time, something that is careful about how it shows itself to the surface world, something that has survived in whatever form it takes by staying mostly invisible and mostly quiet, by letting the surface world explain away what people see as natural causes and mystical stories, by trusting the surface world's habit of explaining away the unusual rather than looking into it. If you were trying to keep an underground community going across a very long time, the method of being there, but not quite there, of letting the stories grow in ways that make serious inquiry seem silly, of appearing once in a while to certain people and trusting that those people will not be able to adequately describe what they have seen in terms that their culture will take seriously, that method would work. It has been working for as long as the written record goes back, and probably long before that. The mountain keeps its secrets because the surface world is very good at keeping them for it. Every time a serious investigator gets close, something happens. The investigation is redirected. The data is put away. The investigator finds themselves in a position where publishing what they found would end their career. The story is absorbed by the legend and made to look like more legend. Whether this is active work from below, from the community itself, or simply the way surface world institutions work, the result is the same. The secret stays hidden. And so we come back to where we began. A mountain standing alone in Northern California, 14,000 feet and more, drawing people to it across centuries for reasons they cannot always put into words. People who feel something pulling them there, something they cannot name, something that starts as a curiosity and grows into a quiet certainty. The certainty that something is there, something old, something patient, something that has been in that mountain longer than anything in the official historical record can account for. Whether that certainty is true, we do not know for sure. Whether the tunnels are real in the physical, mappable, measurable sense, we have not been able to confirm. Whether the community is real, whether the meetings are real, whether the geological oddities point towards something human and intentional, or just toward geological complexity, we cannot say for certain. What we can say is that the question has not been answered. The investigation has not been completed. The evidence has not been fully looked at in a way that takes it seriously on its own terms, rather than filtering it through ideas that make honest looking impossible. The mountain deserves a real inquiry. The witnesses deserve to be heard. The native traditions deserve to be treated as records of careful, long-term observation rather than dismissed as myth. The geological and geophysical oddities deserve to be studied properly rather than blamed on ordinary causes without good evidence for that blame. This is not a closed case. It is an open question. And open questions are the most interesting ones because they still have the power to change everything we think we know. The mountain stands quiet, patient, keeping whatever it keeps, waiting perhaps for the surface world to develop the tools and the honesty to look at it without looking away. We are not there yet, but we are closer than we were, and the question is still alive. That is enough for now. There's a kind of evidence that does not get talked about much in accounts of the Mount Shasta mystery, and that is the evidence from people who tried to leave it alone. There are researchers, journalists, and documentary filmmakers who started projects focused on the mountain's underground traditions and who, at some point in their work, chose to stop those projects without finishing them. Not because they ran out of money, though that happened too. Not because the subject turned out to be uninteresting, quite the opposite, but because they came across something in the course of their research that made them pause in a way they found hard to put into words. One documentary filmmaker who had been working on a project about sacred sites in the American West spent 3 weeks in the Shasta area in the mid-1990s. He had planned to include Shasta as one stop in a wider survey. He ended up spending all 3 weeks there and ultimately chose not to include the Shasta material in his finished film. In an interview given years later, he described his decision in terms that sound vague, but that he was clearly trying to make exact. He said he felt that including the material would be a kind of violation, not of a law or an agreement, but of something he could not name. He said it felt like sharing someone's private letters without permission. The information was real. It was his to use if he wanted. But using it felt wrong in a way he could not justify with logic and could not ignore emotionally. A journalist who spent several months researching the Shasta accounts for a long magazine piece described something similar. She had gathered a lot of material. She had done interviews, looked at archives, talked to geologists and anthropologists. The piece was almost written, and then she did not publish it. She told colleagues at the time that she needed more time with the material. She never went back to it. Years later, she described the decision as one she still did not fully understand. She knew the piece was good. She knew the material was important. Something had stopped her that she could not name. These accounts are just stories. They did not prove anything about what is under the mountain, but they had a texture to the record that is worth noting. The people who got closest to the material, who spent the most time with it, who were in the best position to bring it to a wide audience, often chose not to. Whatever they found in their research, it produced in them not the desire to share it as widely as possible, which is the normal motivation for journalists and filmmakers, but something closer to restraint. A feeling that sharing it would be wrong in a way that came before logical explanation. That is a strange outcome for people who went in hoping to tell a story. The water that comes down from Mount Shasta feeds a large part of Northern California's surface water systems. The mountain snowpack is one of the main sources of water for the Sacramento River and its branches. This is well known and not mysterious. What is less talked about is the underground water system. The mountain snowmelt does not all run off the surface. A significant amount soaks into the volcanic rock, entering an underground water system that is complex and not fully mapped. This water does not all come back out quickly. Volcanic rock can hold water for decades or centuries before it comes out of springs or seeps far from where it went in. The springs around the base of Shasta are therefore connected to rain and snow that fell in the mountain years or decades earlier. The time it takes for the water to travel through the underground system is long enough that the water picks up a certain mineral signature from the rock it passes through. Hydrologists can trace this signature and use it to understand something about the paths the water has taken underground. What the hydrology of the Shasta area suggests is that the underground flow paths are extensive. Water that goes into the mountain's upper slopes can come out of places miles away from the mountain's visible outline. The underground water system spreads the mountain's influence into the surrounding land in ways that are not obvious from the surface. An underground community with knowledge of this water system would have access to water sources spread across a much larger area than just the mountain itself. They would, in effect, have a water network, underground channels moving fresh water through the geological structure in ways that could be used at many points. The springs at the base of the mountain, which witnesses often connect with encounter reports, are exactly the kinds of places where an underground water system would be most accessible from below. This is not proof of anything, but it is another piece of the physical picture that fits well with the idea of long-term underground living. The resources are there. The water is there. The geological structure to support a long-term underground presence is there. The question remains whether anyone is using those resources, but the resources themselves are not in doubt. One part of the Mount Shasta mystery that rarely gets enough attention is its connection to the wider pattern of unusual pre-Columbian North American archaeology. The usual story of pre-Columbian North America describes a continent lived in by hunter-gatherers in the north, with more complex farming societies developing in the south, especially in Mesoamerica. The North American interior and the Pacific coast are described as thinly populated, with relatively simple social structures. This story is wrong in several ways that archaeology has been slowly correcting over the past few decades. The scale of pre-Columbian North American society was much larger than was previously understood. The city of Cahokia, near present-day St. Louis, was larger than London at its peak. The farming systems of the eastern woodlands were more extensive and advanced than early European observers reported. The trade networks connecting different parts of the continent were more complex and long-range than textbooks have generally acknowledged. These corrections have not yet fully changed the popular picture, but they suggest that the usual story has systematically underestimated the complexity of pre-Columbian North America, and that further corrections may still be needed. The Mount Shasta area sits at the meeting point of several important pre-Columbian cultural zones. The cultures of the California coast, the cultures of the Great Basin interior, the cultures of the Pacific Northwest, and the cultures of the desert Southwest all had territories that extended into or near this region. The mountain itself would have been known to people across a very wide area. As a landmark of extraordinary visibility, it served as a reference point in the mental maps of people across the entire far western part of the continent. If there was something important about the mountain, if it was a place of unusual significance or unusual activity, it would have been known about in some form by people across a huge area. The sameness of unusual accounts across many separate cultural traditions might not just reflect independent observation of the same local thing. It might also reflect the sharing of information about the mountain through those long-range trade and communication networks. People across the continent knowing about the mountain, knowing about what it contained, in the way that important sites were known about through the networks that connected pre-Columbian North America. The tunnels under Mount Shasta, if they are real, are not an isolated local curiosity. They are part of a continental story about the depth and complexity of what existed in North America before European contact broke it apart. A story we are still only beginning to understand. Also, like and subscribe to my channel. Ancient Tales sleep. Good night, sweet dreams.